York 1. You'll find out.
Texas heat wave and none in sight. Temperatures top 100 degrees for the 25th straight day. Antelope still play. The drought has been nothing short of a disaster.
Here from the childhood of a generation and one of television's earliest major stars, Buffalo Bob Smith, died today.
St. Kim's, what time is it?
He hosted the Howdy Doody Show for 13 seasons between 1947 and 1960, joined by his marionette sidekick and a cast of characters including Clarabelle and, of course, the Peanut Gallery of tremendously over-anxious children. After he retired from television, he bought several radio stations, made personal appearances around the country. That continued well into this decade. He died of cancer at a hospital near his home in North Carolina. Buffalo Bob Smith, dead at 80 years old. Before we get to a tribute at Arlington,
has died. Buffalo Bob Smith was the cowboy host of the Howdy Doody Show for 13 seasons, side by side with the freckle-faced marionette. A generation of baby boomers will never forget his voice.
Hey, kids, what time is it?
Buffalo Bob Smith was 80 years old.
A lot of Americans lost an old friend today. Buffalo Bob Smith, host of the old Howdy Doody Show. He came along when television was in its infancy and baby boomers in their early childhood.
St. Kim's, what time is it?
Howdy Doody was the first show on television every day in many cities for many years. There was test pattern all day long till Howdy came on.
Bob and Howdy the Marionette went on network television in 1947. They entertained kids at home and in the studio audience, the legendary Peanut Gallery. They did it until 1960 when the show said a final goodbye. Goodbye from us to Buffalo Bob Smith and Howdy Doody Time died today of cancer in North Carolina. Buffalo Bob was 80 years old. And that's part of our world tonight. I'll be back later here on CBS with 48 Hours. Christian Jeanette Myers is here with a preview.
Tonight, abuse at a nursing home caught on tape.
It's just bruise after bruise.
Here's the camera.
You'll be shocked at what they found.
They throw her instead of sitting her in softly. Nobody deserves this at the end of their life.
Later on 48 Hours.
Later is 10 o'clock, 9 Central Time here on the CBS television network. For the CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reporting. I'll see you again soon on 48 Hours. Every story is a local story. An economic change in Asia or a medical discovery in Europe could change your life forever. Finding the connections takes experience. Making them clear is what we do, because our job is to make sure that every story hits home.
The CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Experience you can trust.
CBS.com for news 24 hours a day. Experience CBS News.
The cancer doctor...
A hero is being honored this afternoon. A memorial service will be held at the Johnson Space Center today for astronaut Alan Shepard, who died earlier this month. CNN's John Holloman remembers the first American in space.
NASA's official biography of Alan Shepard begins by saying he's a retired rear admiral and a former astronaut. Talk about understatement. What the document fails to say is that Shepard was a role model for an entire generation of young Americans. As the first American to travel in space, Alan Shepard inspired people like Norm Thagard, the first American to live on the Mir space station, to join the astronaut corps.
The fact that he flew the first flight tells you that he must have been right at the top of his group. So he was at the top of a group that was already at the top of America's test pilots, I would guess, at the time. So the first flight certainly gave him the recognition, and then once he had the recognition, you realize that this was a pretty super guy.
And astronauts were not the only ones inspired.
Alan Shepard understood the odds. He faced them bravely. And he led our country and all humanity beyond the bounds of our planet, across a truly new frontier, into the new era of space exploration.
No one was more dedicated to this country and to the astronaut program, to flying, to the Navy, to being a dedicated patriot in this country. No one is going to exceed Al Shepard in that regard.
Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, wanted to be a Mercury astronaut and told the story of his meeting with Shepard early in the Mercury astronaut selection process.
I first met him when we were in the Mercury selection program together, and he gave me a ride over to the place where we were having our first interviews. And of course, I didn't make it, and Al did. But at that time, you know, he was really sort of a warm fellow, but he could be very aloof at times. We call him either the icy commander or Smiling Al at the Cape.
Shepard's friends and colleagues remember him first as a hero. He won the Medal of Honor, but also as a fierce competitor, something Shepard talked about in his final television interview with CNN.
I think being an astronaut, to me, and I think to most of the chaps, was a continual challenge. It was originally there was a challenge of the selection process, and then as chaps had been training for a couple of years, there'd be another selection process to move into this and that. It was always something because there were a bunch of bright people.
Shepard was 74 years old when he succumbed to his final challenge, a losing battle with leukemia. John Holloman, CNN.
And one correction, Shepard died on July 21st. CNN will have live coverage of the Alan Shepard Memorial Service in Houston today. That's at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's CNN Saturday for now. I'm Gene Randall in Washington.
Listen, the Eagle has landed.
America wins the space race. Moonshot, CNN Perspectives, Sunday.
We'll talk to analyst Stuart Rothenberg about the political effects of the Lewinsky case, both for the White House and the two major parties in Congress. The first man launched into space by the United States is being honored this afternoon. Alan Shepard died early on the morning of July 22nd. A memorial service for the former astronaut is to begin shortly at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. CNN's Jim Hill has more on Shepard's legacy.
On May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard took what he'd later call a pleasant ride to become America's first man in space. Shepard died last month at the age of 74.
Well, there's no doubt about it. The first guy that went into space in the United States had to have a lot of courage.
Moving out. Clear the tower. Nearly 15 years later, astronaut Vance Brand rocketed into space as command module pilot on the historic Apollo-Soyuz mission. As the U.S. crew docked with the Russian Soyuz spacecraft, Alan Shepard, the man on the right, kept track from Earth.
Alan was one of that original core of people that really established the manned space program.
Former astronaut Gordon Fullerton also remembers Shepard, having started his NASA work under Shepard's wing in 1969. Fullerton went on to log 380 hours in space, helping move NASA into the era of the space shuttle, flights which are now almost routine and far different from Shepard's early missions.
Touchdown time was 5 days, 2 hours, 14 minutes, 25 seconds.
His leadership qualities and abilities, I think, largely influenced the way I reacted when I had a chance many years later to do it myself.
At NASA facilities like Edwards Air Force Base, flags were lowered to half-staff.
What Shepard helped start as the first American in space is, of course, far from over. As Brand put it, the space program in one form or another is likely to continue for centuries. Jim Hill, CNN, Edwards Air Force Base, California.
And once again, we will have live coverage of the Alan Shepard Memorial Service set to begin at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Up next.
Hi, meteorologist Valerie Voss in the CNN Weather Center looking at another round of record heat in Texas. We're talking about 106 in Dallas. That was day 26. When last I checked, they were 99 degrees, so today will probably be day 27. Of course, their all-time record goes back to 1980 when they were 42 days in a row at 100 or more. Tyler, Texas on Yesterday, 104. Houston was 103. Lufkin, 107. Longview was 106. And we're going to see some more of that heat. You know, this is a new month, August 1st. During the month of July, Del Rio, Austin, San Antonio, and Shreveport all recorded their hottest months on record. And for today, more of the same, at least across Texas, Louisiana. But you can see that the hot air is confined to a narrow band across the south. The rest of the country seeing 70s and 80s, and I'd probably venture to say that it'll feel a little bit like fall in some areas. Brownsville, Texas, though, their driest ever July on record, and the rain will stay out of Texas today, stretched from the northern Rockies into the southeastern part of the country. More news right after this.
Coming up today on CNN. At 3 p.m., it's World and National News live from CNN in Washington. And at 3:30, Managing with Jan Hopkins profiles today's most successful business managers. Then at 4, catch up on all the latest news, sports, and weather on CNN Saturday. And at 4:30, discover how to earn more, spend less, and invest wisely on your money. That's all coming up today, Saturday, on CNN.
Sunday.
Listen, the Eagle has landed.
America wins the space race. Moonshot, CNN Perspectives, Sunday. CNN.
I'm Gene Randall in Washington. Shortly, we will take you to Houston, Texas, to the Johnson Space Center for a memorial service for American astronaut Alan Shepard, who died early on the morning of July 22nd. He died of leukemia. It will be an impressive array of speakers on hand today to pay tribute to this space pioneer, one of the country's original astronauts and the first American to travel in space aboard Mercury 7 back in 1959. A decade later, Shepard walked on the surface of the moon as the mission commander for Apollo 14 in 1971. With me for this day's ceremony in New York is Jeffrey Kluger of Time magazine, co-author of the book Apollo 13. Jeffrey, I'm not sure how much time we have here before the ceremony begins, but give us just a word about Alan Shepard's legacy.
Well, I think it's important to remember that at the time Alan Shepard flew, what was driving the country wasn't some sense of celestial wanderlust or some grand vision of exploration. What was propelling the country was something more along the lines of fear. We were far behind the Soviets in terms of technology, in terms of heavy lift boosters. All of the rockets we built tended to blow up. And Alan Shepard was the first of the 7 men who was willing to climb on top of one of those rockets, have them ignited underneath him, and fly into space. And I think the enormity of what he accomplished is best measured by the novelty of what he accomplished. No American had done it before.
Now, his 1959 flight, I believe, was just weeks after the Soviets had electrified the world by sending Yuri Gagarin on an orbital flight.
That's right. Yuri Gagarin went up for a single orbit, and Al Shepard went up on top of a little chopstick of a rocket called a Redstone for a little 17-minute flight. It was nothing at all in terms of its scientific significance, but its spiritual and emotional significance was enormous, and it showed that the United States, while certainly not ahead in the space game, was at least in the space game.
We're watching the colors being brought in at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Jeffrey, we're all familiar with the term the right stuff, but what did it take for NASA to choose these first 7 astronauts?
Well, the first 7 astronauts, I think, were, it's important to remember, they were all test pilots. These were rogues, lone wolves, people who were willing to climb into the cockpit of an unproven airplane day after day, realizing that a significant percentage of them were not going to survive. That's something that you and I can't fathom doing.
Okay, let's go to Houston.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner
The scene is the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. One of today's speakers will be Senator John Glenn, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts who returns to space in late October aboard the space shuttle at 77 years of age. Shepard's family will be here today, his wife and his 3 daughters, and I assume at least some of his grandchildren. He has 6. He had 6, rather.
Open his mic. Please be seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
Shepard left the Navy and NASA in 1974. He was a rear admiral at the time in the Navy, went into the construction business in Houston, Texas as the head of a company. These are NASA pictures, and this is a tribute put together by NASA for Alan Shepard. This was the Mercury 7 flight in 1959 when a Redstone rocket carried Shepard into orbit. About 119 miles up, 300 miles downrange. It was quite a success for this country. Shepard has been called one of the greatest pioneers this country has produced and a shining star. In 1971, Shepard became the 5th American to walk on the moon. That was Apollo 14. Shepard was the mission commander. Shepard and lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell spent about 9 hours on the lunar surface. Shepard used the occasion to tee off on a couple of golf balls with a jerry-rigged club. And one of those shots, he said, went miles and miles thanks to the gravity of the moon. We'll be back in just one moment. The Johnson Space Center today in Houston, Texas, a memorial service for Alan Shepard, the first American to travel in space. A suborbital flight, though it was. Watching this with me is Jeffrey Kluger of Time magazine in New York, and we will go back to Houston.
Alan, did you ever consider that you might not get back from the moon? He replied very solemnly, "Oh yes, we thought about that." My friends, this is genuine courage and bravery. This is a tribute to the courage, bravery, and heroism of Alan Shepard, and it is a tribute to all of the astronauts. These are brave men. I am sure I speak for all Americans. We are proud of you, and we admire and appreciate your courage and bravery in the space effort. I could give no more sacred prayer than the following verses from the Bible, Psalms. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. As a young boy who was a Sunday school student, Alan Shepard learned a prayer. His wife, Louise, wants his friends to hear this prayer as he came to know it. She stated that this prayer had a profound influence on his life. This is the prayer by Mary Baker Eddy. Thy kingdom come. Let the reign of divine truth, life, and love be established in me and rule out of me all sin. And may thy word enrich the affections of all mankind and govern them. And from the scriptures, Simon Peter answered him, Lord, we believe and are sure that thou art that Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is the promise that he hath promised us, even eternal life.
Good afternoon. Louise, the Shepard family, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to look out in that audience and almost recognize every face there. We are here this afternoon to remember Alan Shepard as a friend and as a colleague, one who we all admire and will find impossible to replace. In 1959, when the United States decided to fly man in space, the newly chartered NASA needed a number of men to fly their Mercury spacecraft. The requirements for these aviators, and soon to be called astronauts, were reasonably straightforward and unambiguous. A number of us in the Space Task Group had come from the world of airplane flight tests, and we recognized that we needed experienced test pilots who understood the rigors of testing the unknown and were accustomed to putting their lives in jeopardy every time they flew. They had to be prepared to do their job regardless of the threatening circumstances they might find themselves in. We also wanted them to understand the engineering design required of this new flying machine and to be able to participate in its development. Alan Shepard volunteered to be one of the men we were looking for. He came to this new challenge because in his mind, spaceflight was the next step in man's quest to fly higher and faster, and as a Navy test pilot, this was his kind of business. He did not come into the space program looking for glory. Indeed, many of his peers looked with scorn on what they thought was a step backward in test flying and refused to consider themselves as test specimens for a highly experimental program with a questionable future. In fact, if you listen to the so-called medical community who were advising NASA in 1959, the test pilots who were criticizing Project Mercury were justified in their evaluation. The great majority of the doctors believed that man's reaction to this new environment of zero gravity and a perfect vacuum would cause disorientation, nausea, loss of sight, and other dire ailments, and as a result might be totally incapable of doing work, much less conducting the complex and intricate task we were expecting them to carry out. Fortunately, Bob Gilruth and those of us who worked for him believed that a qualified test pilot with proper training could most likely accomplish the same tasks in space that they had been conducting in high-performance airplanes. We wanted the men who were going to fly to be an integral part of the spacecraft, just as they had been in the airplanes they flew. As the first manned flight approached, the competition for being first among the 7 astronauts became very intense. As in any group greater than one, it was difficult to choose who should be selected. Bob Gilruth, a man who never received the proper credit for being the father of manned spaceflight, met with the astronauts and asked them to write a brief essay on who and why they should be chosen to fly the first flight, excluding themselves. From this interesting and provocative exercise, and with the advice and consent of his staff, he picked Alan Shepard to fly the first manned Mercury Redstone flight. These were heady times, and Alan, already charged, doubled his efforts to train for the 15-minute suborbital flight. Unfortunately, Shepard's flight had to be preceded by the flight of a chimpanzee. Although we successfully launched and recovered Ham, the hot engine of the Redstone caused an early shutdown, which precipitated an escape rocket separation, subjecting him to 17G and gave the false impression that the animal had failed to perform. The demand of further Redstone testing and a requirement to test a large number of animals on the Johnsville centrifuge postponed Shepard's flight. Shepard was extremely disappointed and agitated by the delay, as was the entire Space Task Group. The real disappointment came several weeks later when the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit and recovered him after one revolution. With added resolve and the permission of the President's Scientific Advisory Committee, the animal tests were canceled, a test flight of the Redstone was completed, and MR3 was given a green light. After several launch attempts had been scrubbed because of weather, on Friday, May 5th, 1961, Shepard was again ready to fly. NASA had decided to allow the media, including television, to cover the launch in real time, putting tremendous pressure on everyone involved. But this decision turned out to be far wiser than all of us could have imagined. The launch was scheduled for 7 a.m., but clouds and rain covered the Cape. We decided to press on, have Alan enter the capsule, and wait for the weather to clear. The picture I had on my console of Shepard, which you just saw, exiting the trailer at the pad, with searchlights shining on him and his silver spacesuit, is still emblazoned in my mind. It was one of the most exciting moments of our lives. We all waited, and finally the weather began to clear, and we picked up the count. As we reached T-minus 2 minutes, the magic point in a count in those days, Stan White began giving me Alan's vital signs, and he reported his heart rate was increasing and near liftoff reached 180. He was not the only one whose adrenaline was flowing. I looked down to make some notes and suddenly noticed the microphone on my headset was missing. I was about to have it replaced when I realized it was still there, but I was shaking so hard that it appeared as a blur in my eyes. We all remembered Shepard's exclamations during launch, his staccato reporting, and his marvelous description of the Earth and the heavens he viewed from his lofty position. He performed exactly as you would expect the finest test pilot to do, and his entry and recovery were equally spectacular. The Navy helicopter retrieved Shepard and his spacecraft, and history was made. The reaction of the country to this brief suborbital flight was incredible, and Shepard had become the hero he had not set out to be. The world praised the U.S. for its success, but particularly for the willingness to share it with the rest of the world as it happened. This, they reported, was in stark contrast to the Russian secrecy and failure to report their missions until they were successfully completed. The country celebrated the astronauts' accomplishment, and President Kennedy invited Shepard and his colleagues to the White House to receive the country's highest honor. The impression that Shepard's flight made on the country and the world was not overlooked by the President, and within weeks, he had decided to challenge the nation with landing men on the moon and returning them safely to Earth before this decade is out. Alan Shepard had not only become the nation's first astronaut, he had inspired his country to set out on one of its greatest adventures. Alan's contribution to his country, his commitment to the space program, and his willingness to always go the last mile to show it are what made him so dear to all of us. I'd like to end with this prayer from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. Almighty God, we remember this day before thee, thy faithful servant, Alan Shepard. And we pray thee that having opened to him the gates of larger life, thou will receive him more and more into thy joyful service, that he may win with thee and thy servants everywhere the eternal victory through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please, family, guests, friends of Al's, all of us here today. Alan Shepard was many things. He was a patriot. He was a leader. He was a competitor, a fierce competitor. He was a hero. Most importantly to us, he was a close friend. When we 7 were chosen as the first American astronauts, Al stood out. And I had first known Al several years earlier when we were both test pilots at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. But it wasn't until the Mercury program I saw firsthand the determination, the toughness, and the courage of Alan Shepard. I think we have to remember, as Chris referred to a moment ago, it was the depths of the Cold War. We tend to forget that sometimes. And all of a sudden, after Sputnik, America's technological superiority in this world was under serious question. We tried to put up satellites, and we'd failed. We had been beaten in the early days of the space race by a country that bragged that America now sleeps under a Soviet moon, as they twitted us. And it meant something to us. Many kids of the world were going to Moscow for education instead of to our schools in this country, and nations were being affected by the propaganda that was being put out. We'd sum it up by saying it was a very, very low time for American self-esteem. The naysayers and the doubters about our nation were getting very, very serious attention. But Al brought us back. He brought us back because of his leadership in the Mercury program. He brought us back because he carried the American questing spirit on his shoulders into the heavens. He brought us back because Al took that challenge from the Soviets, not only as the patriot he was, Al took that personally. All 7 of us watched some of those early rocket tests, and we watched some of them fail occasionally in very spectacular fashion. We could spend a couple hours here this afternoon talking about our experiences and watching some of the things down there, and then people saying, and you're going to go up on one of those things. But that didn't deter us, and especially it did not deter Al. He named his spacecraft Freedom 7. We were free to name our own spacecraft back in those days, Freedom 7. His view of where this whole program stood in relationship to openness around the world, what we stood for. In fact, as he sat in Freedom 7 through yet another delay before his historic Mercury mission, he was very anxious to get going, and we heard an anxious-to-get-going Al suggest, why don't you fix your little problem and light this candle? And he wasn't making light, but that one moment eloquently portrays Al as Al's dedication to getting the program going. America has lost one of its true adventurers, someone whose entire life was dictated by the American questing spirit. And Alan and Scott and Gordo and Wally and I have lost more than a friend, and we've lost another brother. The National Aviation Hall of Fame every year has an induction ceremony that traditionally closes with the reading of what is without a doubt the single best-known poem among aviators all over the world. It was written by an American who joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and was killed at the age of 19 flying a Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. The words have an even more special meaning to us today than they did in 1977 when the name of Alan Shepard was inscribed in the Aviation Hall of Fame. The poem is titled High Flight. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. Even as we meet here today, Al is now, right now, this very minute, experiencing that ultimate of all times, high flight. But here, we will all miss him very much. To Louise and the family, our thoughts and our prayers are with
you. We'll come back to Houston in just a moment. High praise for Alan Shepard by John Glenn. We'll be right back.
Sunday.
Listen, the Eagle has landed.
America wins the space race. Moonshot, CNN Perspectives, Sunday.
The
The Last Empress, an exotic blend of music, dance, and drama, is a show fit for a queen. Enter to be the grand prize winner of the Royal Sweepstakes, and we'll roll out the red carpet for you with 2 tickets and backstage tour to The Last Empress at Lincoln Center's New York State Theater, dinner at Moreggi Restaurant and Sake Lounge, and a $150 gift certificate to June, New York, where you'll find all the best pens in the world. To enter, come to any of these June, New York locations. Runner-ups get 2 tickets and a sterling silver Parker ball pen from June, New York.
Every night, TLC's the place that moves you. Gets your heart pounding, blood racing, and it's all real. TLC's Adrenaline Rush Hour. Lose yourself in it. Every night at 8. TLC. Adventures through your mind.
Taking you over the edge. Time Warner Cable is the place to be.
Business Unusual with Lou Dobbs, tonight, 8:30 on CNN.
For a long time, both Al and I lived with some names that we were not particularly fond of. His was Bartlett, mine is Malcolm.
This is Scott Carpenter, another of Alan Shepard's Mercury 7 colleagues.
Of always addressing each other by those names. In keeping with that custom, I will now say, my hat's off to you, Bartlett. Thank you for all you have done for the Navy, for the space program, and for your country. It is an honor and a privilege to have known you.
There are 4 surviving Mercury 7 astronauts. We're about to hear from another, Wally Schirra.
Weezer, family, friends, and some military people, I might add, I would like to recommend that we all think of as Rear Alan Bartlett Shepard, Jr., U.S. Navy, Yankee from New Hampshire, Naval Academy graduate, black shoe, Cogswell in the Pacific, brown shoe, naval aviator, aircraft carriers, test pilot, astronaut, and a very generous man. When we were brought, I don't think we really ordered, I think we volunteered, to Langley Air Force Base, we suddenly realized we didn't have any more uniforms. They were gone. We were going to be civilians from then on. Our budget was rather tough because I don't recall, I was talking to Joe, my wife, just the other day, I don't recall ever going to work without wearing a uniform. This was a big transition for us. So we sat in this very humble office, 7 of us, with Nancy Lowe sitting outside, guarding the door as our secretary, wondering what the heck we're doing here. The 7 of us bonded almost immediately. We left on different parts of the continent, literally, to check on engineering drawings, on engineering plans, on engineering symposiums, medical tests, in addition to the original ones we had, briefings, simulations. We were kind of busy. And each Friday we came back and debriefed each other so we knew what was going on. It was the only way we could cover the whole ballpark. With that, we began to realize that each of us were participating in whatever flight we had. But as I watched, I saw Alan Shepard stand out. I made the mistake of voting for him on that pier thing, now that I think about it. As a result, I could see Al was becoming a leader. We had our Mercury program go on, and time came on, and Deke Slayton was to fly, who was remembered here not too long ago. Rather tough to come back again here, but thinking of Deke, we realized that if he was going to be grounded, we better have him in charge. We didn't want, excuse me, Admiral, an admiral coming down to take care of us and be responsible for us. We wanted one of our own. After Mercury, Alan was due to fly Gemini and was grounded because of Meniere's syndrome, an ear problem. Grounded for almost a decade. Deke asked Al, would you help me out and be in charge of the astronaut office? We had 2 great leaders. We've lost 2 of our great leaders. We're down to 4 now. Lost Gus on the launch pad. but the brotherhood we had will endure forever. And it's that interesting part of Alan Shepard that came to light when he got to the moon finally, and he hit that ball for miles and miles. My last recollection of Alan hitting a golf ball was on Kauai, on the 6th green of Ocean 9, on the edge. He drove a ball off the edge into the Pacific Ocean. And he said, that one went miles and miles. I didn't have to take a mulligan. We'll remember Alan B. I was called Skyray by him. The family, of course, we all think of, and it's kind of tough to be called Bartlett, isn't it, Bart? But at least we had a lark in the high flight. And that's the 2 children, grandchildren of Alan, of course. The whole family here I love and feel so very warm. I'll make it. Bye-bye, Al.
Louise and family. I sort of had a message for Al today. We had a lot of adventures together, Al. We're in the first group of 6 contestants. Start out in Washington for a whole week of mental exams, written exams. And then we went on to Lovelace Clinic, and that was very interesting, because they'd been told to weed as many people as they could out. So we were the first of the guinea pigs, if you will, to come through. And it was very interesting. They weeded a lot of people out. They were brutal, but it was a real adventure. Then we went from there to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where we went through the physiological training, where they put us on vibrators, and they dunked us in ice water, and they roasted us in ovens, and they sealed us up in soundproof chambers, and everything they could think of to do to people to really discourage them and see if they could tolerate it. And out of that, then, we had a real adventure in April of '59 when we were all brought out onto a stage like this and announced to the world who the first seven were. And boy, there were lots of cameras, lots of reporters. That was certainly most of us as really exposure to the news media and to cameras and to the world of public relations. But we survived that, didn't we, Al? We got through it. And we survived the Navy Frogman School. We went through UDT training like we went through every other kind of training we could think of. We survived that one, and we roasted in the Nevada desert together. Found out we could learn to get along all right in a desert situation. We survived the jungles of Panama. And we survived the research, and really the research and the running and the engineering that went on the Johnville centrifuge. It was brutal, but it proved how strong, how capable the human body really is. We raced many miles in identical Corvettes. And I'm sorry, Al, that I never told you that I changed the ratio in my differential.